These are the 1.1b notes for PreCalc. We're talking about restrictions on the domain. So in math, there are two things that we cannot do. In other words, if you try to type it into your calculator, you will get an error message. Those two things are divide by 0 and square root a negative. If you do either of those things in the calculator, you'll get an error message. So what we're going to be doing today is exploring different problems and trying to figure out when we will get an error message. We're not actually going to be plugging in numbers. We're just trying to see what the restrictions are. In other words, what numbers will not work into this problem. So restriction number 1, we're going to talk about dividing by 0. So if you have a denominator, in other words, division, you have to make sure that that denominator is never equal to 0. If it's equal to 0, that means you'll get an error message in your calculator and you cannot complete that problem. So for example number 1, I have f of x equals x plus 5 over x plus 3. I'm not worried about the numerator. That's never going to cause me any problems. I'm worried about the denominator. I have to make sure that the denominator is not equal to 0. So anytime you see a denominator, you're going to use the not equal to 0. And from there, just solve. The solving tends to be pretty simple, usually just 1 or 2 steps. So what this tells me is that x cannot be negative 3. In other words, if you try to plug in a negative 3 for both of these x's, down in the denominator you would get 0, and then you would not be able to get an answer. Example number 2. Take your denominator, make sure it is not equal to 0, and then solve. I'll do part of this in my head. I'm going to add 20 to both sides, so that's going to get positive 20. And then divide by 4. X is not allowed to be 5. Because if x is 5, then I get a 0 in my denominator and I cannot get an answer. For examples 3 and 4, notice the denominator is a little bit more complex. So for examples 3 and 4, we're going to need to factor those out. They're x squared problems, quadratic problems, so we'll need to factor. So I'll take the denominator. Again, we're going to say it's not equal to 0. And we'll factor this part. Looking for numbers that multiply to negative 28 and add up to positive 3. That pair of numbers is going to be 7 and 4. The 7 will be positive and the 4 will be negative. That's the only way those will add up to positive 3. And then you take each one of those and say that is not equal to 0. And you can feel free to shortcut this a little bit if you'd like. I'm sure a lot of you can solve this in your head. So subtract 7. So you could just skip a lot of these steps. Oops. All right, so x can't be negative 7 and x can't be positive 4. If you plug in either of those numbers, it's going to give you an error message in your calculator. So that's what we call the restriction on the domain. All right, example 4, very similar. I'm going to take my quadratic, put a little 1 in front of that x, and say that's not allowed to be 0. Then you can factor it. See if you can find the two numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to positive 1. I'll give you just a moment. Hopefully you were able to come up with the numbers 4 and 3. 4 has to be positive, 3 has to be negative. Then you can say each of those is not equal to 0. Again, skipping as many steps as you want here. I'll skip this last step. I'll just subtract in my head. And over here, I'll add 3 in my head. So there we go. X is allowed to be any number except for negative 4 and positive 3. All right, that's our first restriction. It has to do with dividing by 0, has to do with denominators. Our second restriction is when you have square roots. And a square root cannot be negative. So what's underneath the square root has to be greater than or equal to 0. That's how we say not negative mathematically. So under the square root, I'm going to use the greater than or equal to 0 symbol. And then just subtract 2 from both sides. Again, you can do as much in your head as you want, or write out every single step. Your call. So what this means that any number that you're going to plug in for x has to be greater than or equal to -2. If you plug in a number smaller than -2, right there, you're not able to do it because it'll create a negative that you'll need to then try to square root, and you won't be able to. Same thing here. You're going to use greater than or equal to 0. So you're pretty much just matching the restriction, the symbol, with the correct situation. So anytime you see square root bar, you're going to be using the greater than or equal to. Subtract 12. Divide by -3. Remember, when you divide by a -3, you are going to need to flip your inequality. Just maybe making a quick note about that you remember to flip when you divide by a negative. All right, so those are the 2 restrictions. And we have one more situation. We have the 2 situations together. So a square root in the denominator. So anytime you have a square root in the denominator, I'm going to shorten that, you're going to have to use the greater than 0. So notice here, I have a square root that is also part of the denominator, square root in the denominator. So I'll take what's underneath the square root, and I'll use my greater than 0. Add 1 to both sides. X has to be greater than 1. Greater than and greater than or equal to are similar. Greater than 1 means the number 1 is not included. You're not allowed to use 1. Greater than or equal to 1 means that 1 and up will work. All right, I see another square root in my denominator, so I'm going to use my greater than 0 symbol. Subtract 2. I'm going to put a 1 in there so I can divide by -1. We're dividing by a negative again, just like we did on the front side. So we'll flip our inequality to a less than symbol. All right, now you probably have noticed that not very often do you get an error message in your calculator. Most of the time when you plug in numbers, you get an answer. So if that's the case, we have what's called no restrictions, meaning there's no square root and no denominator. These are just more of your regular problems, and no matter what numbers you plug in, you're always going to get an answer. When this happens, you can either write out the words all real numbers, or mathematically, they shorten that to this kind of weird little R. These 2 things mean the same exact thing, either writing out the words all real numbers or writing that R shape. Sometimes you'll see it filled in. Sometimes it'll just look really bold. But anytime I write it, I'll just go ahead and write that double stick like that, all real numbers. So in both of these, example 10 and 9, I don't see any square roots, and I don't see any denominators. So that means I can plug in all the numbers that I want. All right, for examples 11 through 14, you just have some mixed practice trying to identify which symbol is going to match with each of these situations, whether you have a denominator, a square root in the denominator, or no restrictions at all, no square root, no denominator. Take a moment and see if you can at least set each one of these up. You might need to flip your paper over back and forth, but try to get each of these set up correctly. I'll give you a moment. First one, you should have used a greater than or equal to 0. Second one is a denominator, so you're going to use the not equal to 0. Number 13 doesn't have a square root or a denominator, so that is all real numbers, no restrictions. 14 is a combination of restriction 1 and 2, square root and denominator. So we'll use our greater than 0. And solve that. And there we go. You have a Delta Math assignment, and in Delta Math, it's very specific about like what type of answer you're going to put in. So if you are going to type in anything with a greater than, less than, greater than equal to, less than or equal to symbol, you're going to make sure you click the drop-down menu and click interval. Then if you need to put in an R, you just drop it down to all real numbers. If your answer is something like example 12, x is not equal to 2, you will choose the all values except 1. And if you have problems where you have 2 answers where you had to factor, you'll click the selection all values except 2. Let me know if you have any questions.